Tonight we welcome Dr. Ella Gilbert. She graduated in 2014 with a bachelor's in environmental geography and international development. She then got her master's in climate change, followed immediately by a PhD in Antarctic climate change, all of these from the University of East Anglia. She is now a postdoc at the University of Reading and a presenter concerned with communicating climate science to non-specialised audiences, and her talk tonight promises to offer some optimism in the fight against climate change. So I'll pass over to you now, Ella. Thanks.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I will just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Amazing. Great.
Yes, all good.
Fabulous news. Okay, so yeah, as mentioned, I'm hoping that you will come away from today feeling slightly more optimistic and hopeful about climate change, because if we need anything, it is optimism right now. And also well done to anyone who got the Ian Jury reference in the title. I found that lots of people don't get that. And I think, you know, that song is all about, you know, getting up and doing something about stuff, even when the world tells you that you shouldn't. So hopefully we can harness that sentiment and come away with renewed vigor and inspiration to do something about the climate crisis, and to have an encouraging and stimulating discussion, hopefully, as well. So first up, I've already had a lovely introduction, but I have, I guess, two hats. And firstly, I am a scientist, currently at the University of Reading, but I spent a large chunk of my time at the British Antarctic Survey. So my degrees are from the University of East Anglia, but confusingly, I spent all of my time at the British Antarctic Survey, where I was lucky enough to go to Antarctica. So a lot of my specialties are in polar regions. So you may see some kind of a polar bias in a lot of this. At the moment, I'm looking at the climate impact of aircraft and aviation via their impact on clouds. And generally, I'm a climate modeler, so I spend a lot of time writing code and looking at screens, which is unfortunate. But with my other hat on, I've had a long and illustrious career as a climate activist. This picture is from, I think, 2007, when I was 18 or 19, dressed as a cheetah, because for whatever reason, I used to do that at every single protest I went to. I've subsequently grown out of the dressing up as a leopard, but I just have a small patch of leopard print hair instead. I've been involved in environmental campaigning for many, many years, predominantly focusing on kind of fossil fuel industry and aviation and energy sort of sources. So really keen to contribute to solving the climate crisis from multiple angles, both a research and a political sort of standpoint. And part of the reason that I kind of got into climate science and Antarctic climate science particularly is because it's almost like the epitome of like untouchable wilderness environment, and it seems to be so captivating and fascinating, and hopefully you'll agree with me that it inspires awe and wonder and kind of a passion to protect the natural world and all the people and creatures that live in it. So with that said, I would like you to take a deep breath and join me on a plunge into the terrifying nature of climate change, first of all. So I want you to welcome the fear and join me on the rundown, because this bit is essential, I hate to say. We all need, I'm sure all of you know the kind of the basics of climate change, but I think if you put it all together, it does really hammer home the scale of the challenge, and it's important to note this first. So let's go, shall we? Now, first up, we've got the sort of long-term background. And here, this plot is showing you 800,000 years worth of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And these are derived from ice cores, which we collect in Antarctica predominantly. And here you've got one of these lovely ice cores in an image probably held by my ex-colleague Rob Mulvaney at Bass. And you can see loads and loads of little air pockets in these ice cores. And inside each of these air pockets is like a time capsule that's a window into the ancient past. So as snow falls, it traps all of this air in these little pockets. And that means that you can extract the air that was trapped in these bubbles and recreate what the atmospheric composition was like 400,000, 800,000 years before present, which is how we derive these records. And you can see that over this entire period of time, you've got a relatively periodic variation in CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. It seems to happen over relatively common periods, and it goes from 180 to 280-ish parts per million. And that happens quite reliably. So if I remove this conveniently placed ice core, you will see that the 2018 average is a very significant increase on what has historically been the maximum. So it's pretty much double. Instead of going from 200 to 300, it's gone from 200 to 400. And this rate of anthropogenic climate change is the thing that we're worried about. It's not so much the magnitude, it's the speed at which it's happened, because that is unprecedented in most of our geological records. We haven't seen it happen this fast in any analogues that we can find. And so modern climate change is a little bit like playing hockey. And the hockey stick graph is something that is really famous. You might have heard of it. It essentially describes that rate of change. So here we've got a slightly more zoomed in view. So we're thinking about the last 1,000 years here. And here we've got an anomaly relative to the 1961 to 1990 average of surface temperature. So blue and below this zero line is all colder than that 30-year period, and red and periods above this 0 degree line are all warmer. And what you can see is that for a very long time, temperatures were cooler than 1961 to 1990, and then they rapidly shot up. So this is again that hockey stick that you can see here. Now we're going to do one last zoom in. So here we've got, the last since 1880, so the pre-industrial period. And again, we've got an anomaly in terms of temperature, 0 being the baseline. And we can see that the rise in temperature has been relatively steady and that it is continuing. Now, global temperature rise doesn't necessarily make a huge amount of sense in and of itself, because a global average is not an intuitive thing that we can experience or feel or understand, nor is it representative of the variation that happens across the world. So I thought it might be helpful to think about how climate change and temperature rise influences places like the UK. So this set of schematics is from a project by the UK Met Office that attempted to use really high resolution computing to project specifically the future of the UK in a warming climate. And what they found that generally we're expecting to see hotter, drier and more intense summers, plus wetter, milder winters. So ongoing temperature rise means we're going to get more hot summer days, more heat waves essentially, and that we're going to get drier summers as a result. Unfortunately, we're also going to get wetter winters, and they're going to be milder, so less snow, more rain, unfortunately. And in the summer, we're likely to get much more intense rainfall. So although it'll be drier overall, we'll get much more intense bursts of rain. So think summer thunderstorms, for example. And this is going to mean more extreme events. So we're going to be having to deal with many more of those. So things like heat waves, things like droughts, hosepipe bans, etc. And this is something that we're already seeing. So 2019 and 2020 both broke records. You may recall some of the heat waves that are shown in these plots. This is from June 2019, in which I think temperatures across Europe rose, I think they're about 10 or 12 degrees above average for the month. And this was the hottest July or hottest day ever recorded in the UK in, I can't remember the actual date, I think it was July 2019 or 2020, but reached almost 40 degrees, which is pretty unheard of for the UK. And this is another one where you can see huge heating over the Arctic. So what we know about this is that extreme events are already happening, and we're starting to see the effects of climate change already. It's not just temperature records that are getting smashed, but it is all across the board, different extreme events. We're seeing heat waves not only in Europe, but also in polar regions. And this is, of course, a problem when we start to think about what happens when you have melting ice. So I don't know if many of you saw this picture, but it went viral, at least on environmental science Twitter, whether it did elsewhere. But this was a picture taken in 2019 from Greenland, where it looks like these sledge dogs are walking on water. And that's because there was a heat wave, which caused the sea ice to melt pretty much across the entire extent of it, and created huge amounts of meltwater. I think in one day it was 12 billion tons of meltwater, which isn't, a number I have an intuitive sense of, but it is what we were expecting or predicting for the middle of the century without mitigating climate change. So this is the sort of level of melting and meltwater production that we were expecting very much later in the century. So that gives you some context. So it's not just melting, but climate change generally exacerbates extremes, and they become more common and in some cases become more intense. So what used to be a 1 in 100 year event is now on its way to becoming something more like a 1 in 10 year event. So that means things like more intense heat waves and droughts, more prolonged heat waves and droughts, more intense rainfall events, flooding, increased storminess potentially, increased intensity of storms, wildfires, you name it. Pretty much any natural disaster could be amplified as climate change progresses. And thinking about wildfires, we had a pretty intense wildfire season last year. In California, it was the worst fire season on record. And 3 out of 5, I think, of the worst ever fires in that part of the US happened during last August. I think there were some pretty terrifying statistics, like maybe 1,000 football fields worth of forest was burning every half an hour. And in 2020, I think it was 2.3 million acres of forest was burned, in contrast to about 118,000 in 2019. So it puts it into context. It was a hugely burny year. And it wasn't just in the US either. So those fires actually ended up reaching the Arctic. And of course, it's really not a good thing when you're getting fires in the Arctic, not only because it's causing melting, but also because it's thawing the permafrost. And that means that, that when the permafrost thaws, it releases a huge amount of greenhouse gases, both methane and carbon dioxide. And this was partly such an issue because the permafrost is so carbon rich, any small ignition of fire means that it can kind of smolder. And these were called zombie fires because as soon as they spark, they can continue underneath the ground even, continue burning without necessarily going up in flames, but it continues to burn through all of the carbon material under the frozen soil. And alongside this, there were heat waves in the Arctic, a record of 45 degrees set in Siberia, which is absolutely bonkers. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about the atmosphere, and I apologize for my atmospheric bias. I am an atmospheric scientist after all, but it is really important to note that climate change affects the oceans too, and it's an easily forgotten element of climate change. So since the pre-industrial revolution, oceans have absorbed the vast majority of all of the heat that we have produced and a huge chunk of the CO2 that we've produced. And that is an amazing service because oceans are therefore slowing the rate of climate change that we experience on the surface. And this plot shows you the increase in amount of ocean heat content from 1940 to 2018. And the colors just indicate depths. So the darker blue is for deeper oceans. And we can see it's been a pretty dramatic increase over the last several decades. Now, not all oceans are created equal either. And here I've got some of my Antarctic bias showing again. But the Southern Ocean that surrounds Antarctica really punches above its weight in terms of heat and carbon dioxide absorption. So because it's so cold and polar, it's a region of what we call bottom water formation. So it sucks up and stores a lot more CO2 and heat than other oceans elsewhere in the world. And it therefore acts as a really important carbon sink. So it sucks up and stores all of these extra greenhouse gases long term. And in 2017, I was really lucky. I got to be involved in a campaign down in Antarctica where we were checking and studying whether how quickly the ocean is absorbing atmospheric CO2 and heat. And to do that, we were flying very low in the atmosphere, ironically, to measure the fluxes and the transfer of heat and greenhouse gases between the top layer of the ocean and the bottom layer of the atmosphere, with an idea to be able to quantify how much of this is being stored long term and whether the Southern Ocean as a sink is becoming almost saturated. So I thought I would show you a quick video of what it's like to give you a flavor of what it's like to go on a scientific research flight in Antarctica, and I'm hoping this will let me play it on. Oh, maybe it won't. It did earlier. Oh, how sad. It worked in our tech rehearsal.
It sometimes works better if you exit the slideshow and just show it on. Perfect.
Laser pointer at fault. So here we're starting on our ascent over the Antarctic Peninsula. It's got some pretty spectacular scenery, some incredible mountains. I mean, to get anywhere, you pretty much have to transit over the mountains, which are about 2,000 meters high in most places. This is just to prove this. Actually, I was there. So eventually you end up going a lot lower, as you can see here, over the ice shelf. And here we're interested in measuring the kind of the transfer in the lowest part of the atmosphere. So yeah, we're treated to some pretty spectacular views. There you can see the nose boom that allowed us to collect data about three-dimensional winds, which we use to calculate those transfer rates and the flow rates between the atmosphere and the ocean. It's probably John the pilot cracking me up with jokes about ducks again. And here we've got the sea ice. So flying along over ice shelves and open water and sea ice, the flow between atmosphere and ocean is different depending on what the surface is you're over. And there you can see literally how low we were, probably about 15 meters above the surface. So it requires some pretty skillful flying. Right, enough of the self-promotion. So now we've had a taster of what it's like to fly in Antarctica, just keeping our polar hat on for a moment. All of that warming, the warming ocean, the warming atmosphere, leads to melting ice. And ice shelves, ice sheets, and sea ice are all affected. Particularly ice shelves, which are these floating platforms of ice, are at risk because they're sandwiched between the warming ocean and warming atmosphere. And this can be relatively catastrophic because ice shelves act to hold back a lot of the ice that flows in glaciers off of the ice sheets. So if you remove an ice shelf, it's like pulling the plug in the sink, and all the ice that's currently on land can flow much faster and unrestrained into the ocean, which is what contributes to sea level rise. So in the West Antarctic particularly, we're concerned about a warming ocean. So ice shelves in this region are really rapidly accelerating because lots and lots of warm ocean water is able to penetrate under these ice shelves and melt them from below. And that's mostly by virtue of their geography, because they are sitting on top of what we call a retrograde slope, which means they slope backwards. So the seabed slopes backwards with distance from the offshore bit. And as warm water can get underneath the ice shelf, it starts to melt at this kind of boundary between the ice sheet and the ice shelf where it starts to float. And as that proceeds, it can push back this line, which is the kind of balancing line, I guess, and more of this open cavity underneath the ice shelf gets opened up, and then more ocean water can get in, more melting can occur, it can push it back even further and further, and we see this positive reinforcing feedback whereby ice shelves retreat very, very quickly, and that allows the glaciers that feed them to accelerate. And this is what we're seeing here. So these red bits are where ice sheets and the glaciers are accelerating really quickly and contributing much more to sea level rise. And this is naturally something that we are concerned about. So the West Antarctic ice sheet contains enough ice to raise global sea levels by 3.5 meters or so. This map on the left shows us what Europe would look like if all the ice in both Antarctica and the Arctic were to melt. So 58 meter contribution from Antarctica and about 8 from Greenland. We can see that the coastlines would be dramatically redrawn. For those of us in London, it's bad news. Similarly, the Netherlands, a lot of coastal regions in Europe, but also many large conurbations, you know, Shanghai, New York, Miami, entire Pacific Island developing states, countries like Bangladesh that are very low-lying. This is really bad news. Of course, this isn't going to happen tomorrow, but any amount of sea level rise is increased risk. And of course, it doesn't stop there, because it isn't equally distributed across the world. And this is what this figure on the right shows you as well, that you see more sea level rise in some places than others. So thinking about the kind of how this is going to progress, as I said, we're not going to see sea level rise of 68 meters this century, for example. So it's more helpful to think about things in our own lifetimes. And here we've got sort of the flip side of this, and we're thinking about global average sea level rise over time. So from 2000 to 2100, and this is for 3 different scenarios. First up, we've got very stringent mitigation. So this is Paris consistent, likely to result in around about 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial by 2100. And this is, you know, mitigation starting yesterday. This is the one we're currently on, which is a sort of business as usual, keep emitting, maybe some mitigation measures, but not a huge number of them, which results in 3 to 4, possibly even 5 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And then the one in the middle is somewhere in the middle. So with really strict mitigation, we might see 40 centimeters of sea level rise on average globally. Whereas if we keep doing what we're doing, it's more like 1 meter. And that is going to be a significant difference for people who live near the coast, but also for anyone who gets pushed out of their homes and induces migration, all of this kind of thing. So we should all be caring about this. In the UK specifically, this is again from those climate projections from the Met Office. The sea level rise projections look a bit different. So here we've got this optimistic scenario, and it shows you that the majority of sea level rise is going to occur in the southeast in the UK, but it's not too terrible. It's, you know, up to 40 centimeters ish, 50 centimeters in some parts of the south coast. Then if we look at the worst case, or one of the worst case scenarios, our current trajectory shows that in London and the southeast particularly, we're going to see up to 1.1 meters of sea level rise by the end of the century, which is bad news for those of us who live in London, but I mean, it's bad news for all of us around the UK. And I think the thing to mention here is that I could go on and on and on, but I really don't know if there's any point. I mean, this doesn't even touch on ecological impacts, on the human impacts, on the impact on security, on migration, on agriculture, on every single sector of society. It doesn't even begin to delve into those. And climate change is one of those problems that touches every single sector of every single part of our lives. So with that said, I think it's really easy to feel scared, to feel terrified, to feel overwhelmed by this body of evidence. And even though I didn't put everything in, even myself looking at all of this evidence and these statistics, I feel horrified a lot of the time. But I don't necessarily think that fear is always helpful unless we use it for positive good. And I'm going to try and give you some inspiration to use that fear and turn it into something positive. So this is the good bit of the talk. It's all uphill from here. So how do we translate this fear to use it for positive change? And I've taken a huge amount of inspiration from the climate strikers and the young people around the world who are rising up to take things into their own hands. And they are angry and they are doing something about it. So I think that we can all channel this attitude of this is a scary thing. We should be angry about it and use our anger to convert it into action. So I'm hoping that we can all come away from today feeling a little bit more angry and a little bit more motivated to take action. So the first thing that I take inspiration from and that I'm optimistic about is the explosion of protest movements. I mean, how many people now would not recognize Greta Thunberg? And the fact that it went from just this one young woman outside the Swedish parliament every Friday for however long, and now that it's a movement that outside the pandemic mobilizes hundreds of thousands of young people week in and week out, is hugely inspirational. And the proliferation of climate strikes across the world, not in just any specific countries, but all over the world, is really, really encouraging. And then we've also got the movements like Extinction Rebellion, which, whatever you think of their methods, they have really driven a change in the way we talk about climate change. They've brought people to the streets. They have kept going, even through the pandemic. And it just shows that people are really, really tired of saying they don't care, and that they're really inspired to take action. And this is only a good thing. It's working. The second thing that I think is really encouraging and inspiring is that we're all talking about climate change. If you've ever seen a climate scientist called Catherine Hayhoe give a talk, and if you haven't, I would very much recommend looking her up. She often says that the most important thing that you can do to solve climate change is to talk about climate change. And I really do agree with her. I think the fact that we're all talking about it brings it into the public awareness. It means that we're more able to be in a position to do something about it. And the more we talk about these things, the more the solutions will become apparent. Now, this film, I don't know if you've seen it, but I went to see it in the cinema and I cried my eyes out. It was so powerful and so moving. And I mean, even though I knew all of the facts that were presented there, it just demonstrates the power of good climate filmmaking, that it can inspire such emotion and, I mean, sadness, but also it made me really motivated to go away and do something about climate change. And David Attenborough in recent years has been quite vocal on this topic, even suggesting that the UK cannot be radical enough in its approach to climate change. And he's sort of changed his attitude towards solutions somewhat in recent years, and has acknowledged that it's not about saving the planet, because, you know, the planet will survive in its whatever form. It's about saving ourselves. And that sort of starts touching on elements of climate justice, which I think are also really, really vital. Now, speaking of David Attenborough, we've done it before. And the Attenborough effect is a very real thing. So since Blue Planet 2 aired, and I think that was in 2017, because I watched most of the episodes in Antarctica, like more than half of people who were polled reported using less plastic. So again, it just demonstrates the power of good communication, of good filmmaking, but also of talking about these issues. So how many people now carry a reusable water bottle or have a reusable coffee cup instead of a disposable one? I mean, even though we've gone backwards slightly, given the pandemic and the rise of more kind of disposable plastics, it's really quite dramatic if you consider where we were in 2016 versus where we are now in terms of our attitudes about plastic. I mean, try finding a plastic straw in a bar now. I mean, try finding a bar right now, but outside of the pandemic, at least. And this brings me to my third thing. So even governments are waking up, and we all know that governments tend to be a little bit slow moving when it comes to public opinion on these sorts of things. But after the huge numbers of protests staged in 2019 and 2020, the UK government declared a climate emergency in the 1st of May 2019. That was in response partly, I think, to the efforts of activists like Extinction Rebellion, etc. And the UK was the first country to pass into law requirements to go towards net zero, so balancing all of your emissions with reductions or removals of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And this is a really momentous thing, and it does continue in the UK's vein of trying to set an example when it comes to climate. They were also the architects of one of the first legally binding pieces of legislation in 2008. And it's not just the UK either. So the recent election, which of course is a huge relief to people who care deeply about the environment, is also reason to be hopeful, because Joe Biden was elected on a very green mandate, and it shows that pressure from younger and democratic voters is building. People want decisive action on climate change, and that's really, really important in a country like the US, and very, very encouraging after the, let's say, tumultuous presidency of Donald Trump, which was pretty devastating for environmental action. So just as an example, I mean, this week, I think Biden's reinstated the social cost of carbon to try and quantify what greenhouse gas pollution really does, not necessarily just to have the cost of something, but also to incorporate the costs associated with that pollution. And legally binding legislation like that, and like the UK's climate targets and like the UK's climate legislation, can be hugely effective. And we've done it before. This is really, really crucial to note as well. So, I mean, 30 years ago, we discovered that there were these chemicals, these CFCs that were depleting ozone and causing huge environmental issues. So ozone depleting substances, which used to be found very ubiquitously, aerosols, like fridges, all of this kind of, these sorts of widely used appliances were depleting ozone and stopping us, and ozone is the most important thing for stopping us getting completely fried by UV light, and it also has a climate impact. And just a few short years later, if you fast forward, when world leaders got together for having discovered this huge problem, they were getting together to pass legally binding, internationally legally binding legislation to cut their emissions of ozone depleting substances. And now it's one of the major, I would say, one of the major legislative successes when we think about environmental legislation. So in 1987, the Montreal Protocol was signed, which is this international treaty to limit the emission of ozone depleting substances. It was signed on the 16th of September, 1987. And you can see here that this was the ozone concentration on that day, where blue colors are lower ozone concentrations and warmer colors are higher concentrations. And this is the same image today, or not today, the most recent image that I could get today. And it shows that in that time period, that 30 years, we've gone quite a dramatic way. There is a huge difference. And ozone is actually predicted to recover to pre-anthropogenic influence levels by mid-century. So this is a really good news story, and it shows that we can do it. Now, recreating that sort of experience for climate change is possible, and we've started already on our efforts to do that. And the Paris Agreement is this landmark piece of legislation that aims to keep warming to well below 2 degrees and to attempt to keep it below 1.5 degrees. So really, if we can meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement, then we will be able to minimize the worst effects of climate change. And this is only going to be possible by peaking emissions as soon as possible, in the words of the IPCC, and to undertake rapid reductions thereafter. And that means for most countries becoming net zero, so balancing all your emissions with reductions by 2050. And countries have submitted their pledges, what they call NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, and they pledge the ways that they're going to do this to meet this target of net zero emissions by 2050, and show a pathway to actually achieving that warming or limited warming target. Unfortunately, the pledges that we currently have are probably not going to get us to this target yet. And this brings me to the next exciting and encouraging part, that 2 of the biggest international players have started to get back involved with Paris. And I mean, 2 years ago, when everything seemed to be going to hell in a handcart, with the US exiting the Paris Agreement and then China not really getting involved in the process either, it sounded and seemed very dire. But in the last few months, I mean, the US has re-entered the Paris Agreement, and they represent about 15% of global emissions. And China has published its targets and plan to become carbon neutral by 2060, with emissions peaking and declining before 2030. And they're responsible for 1/4 of global emissions. So together, these 2 players are huge. And I mean, China's pledge alone will reduce the amount of warming by the end of the century by 0.2 to 0.3 degrees C, which is absolutely momentous. So although we've got a mammoth undertaking to limit warming to 1.5 degrees with our Paris pledges, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. The re-entry of the US and China means this is definitely much more possible. So at the next conference of the parties in Glasgow, hopefully we'll end up with another kind of significant landmark conference that can be as good as Paris and take us forwards as much as possible. Here in this plot, we can see the warming projections with different scenarios. So you've got what is projected to be the baseline if nothing happens. Then we've got current policies in this darker blue color. So this is what's already in law. And then pledges and targets is what people say will probably do it, but it's not necessarily legally binding. And then optimistic net zero targets takes us a sniff away from 2 degrees. And then we've got the more pathways that are consistent with 2 and then 1.5 degrees. So it is definitely a good picture if you compare business as usual with where we are now, but you can still see that we do have a ways to go, and that's only going to it's going to require all of us pulling our fingers out. But lastly, look what we can achieve. I mean, if I've learnt nothing from the pandemic, it is that human ingenuity is unbridled. It shows us what we can achieve when we put our minds to it. I mean, think of a world a year and a half ago where we weren't doing online conferences like this via Zoom. Probably none of us ever heard of Zoom, in fact. And video conferencing, I know at least in the climate sciences, and this is climate change science, video conferencing was pretty unheard of, and you were still expected to go in person to present work. And now that is just so different. Look at the difference in air pollution. This is NOx quality, or NO2, in fact, quality between pre-pandemic and pandemic years. Another example from my own work is looking at the impact of aviation during lockdowns versus before. I mean, although these things are manufactured by a pandemic, it shows us what can happen and the dramatic changes that can occur if something dramatic happens. And that dramatic thing doesn't necessarily have to be a pandemic. It can just be us all deciding to make a big difference. Look what we can achieve. Again, in 2020, we reduced our emissions by 7%. And this is the sort of magnitude of emissions reductions that we're going to require year on year this decade if we are going to meet a target of 1.5 degrees. And as I said before, although this time it was due to lockdowns, we do already have the means and the tools at our disposal to achieve this without jeopardizing our mental health or our physical health or any of the social justice issues. And we don't have to live in lockdowns to achieve these sorts of changes. We just need to implement what we already know how to do. Because finally, we already have the solutions. We already know that we need to increase our efficiency, reduce the amount of emissions we produce for all of the things that we want to do. We know that we need to shift towards more electrification in terms of industry, infrastructure, transport, etc., and to decarbonize our supply of electricity. So shifting towards renewables, particularly with heating as well, limiting the amount of waste we produce and reusing things in innovative ways, trying to integrate different elements of our economy and our society so that we can all use different parts of the same kind of circle and cycle. Then we need to enhance natural carbon sinks, so forests and oceans and all of the amazing environments that we already have. And then finally, we've got this artificial sucking up of CO2. So if we can draw down carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and store them artificially, that can also complement developing those natural carbon sinks. And there are so many different ways to reduce emissions and also to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's more about the political will to implement them. So this is the oldest carbon negative technology, but this is the sort of thing that we're going to need to achieve that goal. And it's things like reforestation and rewilding and peat bog restoration and soil management have all become much more popularized of late. And it's important to note that these don't just have positive impacts for the climate, it's also good for biodiversity, for human health, for mental health, for water pollution, air pollution. All of these things have these positive side effects, which are only going to add to our lives. Then we've also got some artificial carbon negative technologies, and this is essentially humanity's attempt to emulate trees, these gigantic fans in the middle of the desert that suck up greenhouse gases and store them underground or turn them into liquid synthetic fuel. I mean, it's so amazing and inspiring that people have managed to do this. And I think this is one of the first megaton scale plants ever developed. It's a Canadian company, and they can suck up carbon dioxide from the air and turn it into either liquid fuel to power their vehicles or store it in old oil fields and gas fields. And then finally, I'm just sharing with you some of the most exciting and encouraging innovations I've come across. But I think something like this is also really exciting. Cementless concrete that actually captures CO2 whilst it dries, and each of those concrete blocks can store carbon or greenhouse gases long term, as long as the building exists. And to add to this, it's also made from waste from steel production. So it's not only is it carbon negative, but it's also reusing waste products. And this is it, isn't it? It's, if the pandemic has shown nothing, it's the extent of human ingenuity. And we need to think laterally. We need to understand that we can do this. We know what we need to do. It's just a matter of thinking about how to integrate these solutions and the things we already know, the things we already have, into an approach to tackle climate change. Because although there isn't any one thing that's going to solve climate change, we have all the technology, we have all the tools, we know what we need to do, we just need to implement them. And the implementation of that will probably require some creative thinking outside the box. So I hope that you've come with me on the journey from abject terror to anger and rage, to inspiration, and to thought about the carbon negative future and the bright, bold new world that we're hopefully going to manufacture for ourselves. And I'm hoping that you'll join me on in our climate action. I hope you're feeling renewed and invigorated to actually implement and do some of these solutions. So I think, yeah, questions, if you have any, I will be very happy to answer.
Yeah, the chat's open if anybody wants to post a question in the chat, or if you just want to raise your hand, and you can free to unmute yourself. Thanks, Ella, that was a really interesting talk, and yeah, definitely had some optimism and reasons to be cheerful. I especially loved the videos of the Antarctic. Brilliant.
There's a lot of them on my YouTube if you have a desire for more.
No questions yet in the chat. Just Susan says thank you for such an interesting lecture. I can't see if anyone's got their hand raised. Oh, Andrea, yeah, if you want to unmute and come in.
Hi, Ella. Thank you very much. That was sorry, I'll put my camera on. I'm in the darkness though, so you won't be able to see very much. Anyway, thank you very much. That was a really really nice, interesting talk. Although I have to say, I reached for my bottle of Prozac at about the halfway point. The one thing I would just comment on is that I think you could also, amongst the reasons to be cheerful, actually think about the private sector more. And you know, one of the things which is really staggering is the learning curves for renewables technologies. And you look at the economics of solar, of wind, of battery technology, and so on. They have, you know, gone way faster than any of the sort of professional, you know, the world, you know, the International Energy Agency, you know, any of those people ever predicted. And the only people who came close to getting the drop in the price of solar power right were in fact Greenpeace, ironically. And I think that is one of the things which is really going to make quite a big difference as well, is the fact that, you know, coal is going out of business, not because it's dirty, but because you can't make money out of it. And that is increasingly the case for a lot of thermal power. And there are changes, particularly in rapidly developing countries. Everybody goes, oh, China, oh, India. But, you know, the number of plants that were planned that are being canceled, you know, that stuff is changing quite fast. So I'd be interested to know where you would put that amongst your sort of reasons to be hopeful.
Now that's a really, really good point. And in fact, I think I did a little bit of work last year on carbon offsetting, and the sort of huge number of companies who are suddenly thinking that they need to start investing in carbon negative technologies, and also to drive the demand for nature-based solutions. even though it's to offset their emissions. I mean, the likes of Shell and Amazon saying they're going to become carbon neutral, you can take that with as many pinches of salt as you like, but I think the fact that they're doing it at all does say quite a lot about it, and they're driving innovation in many different realms, not even just energy, although that is a really great example. And we've all known that fossil fuels have been heavily subsidized for a long time, and that the economic argument for renewables is really, really strong. And that's just one area where, you know, private investment and private R&D has really pushed forwards our ability to actually tackle climate change. And a lot of these solutions come from the private sector, almost all of them.
To večne serije даже raskara virusa tam čak
There's always one.
We've got a question, an interesting question from Asma. If there was one thing you'd want individuals to do to help, what would that one thing be?
That's really great as a question. I think people often say things like fly less and eat less meat, but I think personally, the focus on individual action like that distracts from the fact that the people responsible for this are big organizations, big polluting companies like fossil fuel companies, fossil fuel industry, governments that are investing in irresponsible industries like that. And I think the most useful thing that we can all do as individuals is to get angry and to get involved in some kind of action, whether that's writing to your MP, whether that's going on a protest, whether that's talking to all of your friends about climate change, whatever it is. Any small kind of act of activism or action, I think, is really, really helpful.
Great, thanks. And we've got a question through from, Andreas, in total agreement with you. Thought about it and join a pressure group. Good to know. And Susan asks, the chat keeps jumping as people post. Has there been any consideration about the number of ships in the Arctic?
Number of ships, as in the crossing? I don't know the kind of consideration you mean, but I know that one of the first voyages across the Arctic happened, I think there was a shipping vessel that did its traverse. It was in the news this week or the one before. It's worrying how quickly Arctic sea ice is diminishing in its extent and also thickness. And I mean, I remember at university doing an essay on when will Arctic sea ice when will the Arctic be sea ice free in the summer? And I remember writing, I don't know, around about 2040 or something. And it seemed very far away. And all of a sudden, it doesn't seem so far away at all. And we're now talking about being able to ship goods directly from Asia to Europe via the Arctic. And that's happening now. So I don't know if that really answered the question, but it is something that is only going to get more common because, as we've already sort of touched on, the economic incentive for companies is usually the bottom line.
We've got a question come through from Christopher. He says, what is your opinion on electric cars, which are said to have more negative impact on the environment than the normal ones?
I'm not an expert. In terms of the mining, I presume, and that sort of thing, and the manufacture and the sort of life cycle carbon emissions, I think that overall we do need to move to a more kind of electrified future. And currently, with our present electricity mix, electric cars don't necessarily always make sense, and we don't necessarily have the infrastructure to support them. But we cannot rely on fossil fuels, and the production of hydrogen is just never going to be big enough to support the current level of road transport that we have. And I think even if you have hydrogen, you have to produce it somehow, and that's again another demand on the electricity supply. So it's hard to kind of get around it. But I suppose, as I said throughout, I think it's a matter of throwing everything that we have at the problem. It's not about choosing one thing over the other. I think with transport it's a bit different because you kind of have to choose one route or the other. But generally speaking, all the facets of the attack are necessary. So everything that we've got, I think, is going to be necessary. And then
we've got a final question from Saf. I've been reading about the slowdown of the Atlantic Meridian, overturning circulation, AMOC, recently. What are your thoughts on this and the extreme weather changes to come with this?
That's an interesting question. I actually did, I got interviewed by some news channel about extreme weather events, and we just looked at film clips, and the journalist just showed me clips from films like The Day After Tomorrow, in which like fairly crazy extreme weather events happen. And the slowdown of the AMOC is genuinely a thing that's happening. In fact, a study was published this week or last by some colleagues showing that the circulation is weakening. And it's to do with the fact that as temperatures rise in the ocean, it melts more sea ice, and then you get this injection of fresh water, which dilutes the sort of bottom water formation region, which means that it is not so strong a gradient between high and low temperature water, and then you get this weakening of the circulation, and the circulation is what brings warm weather to the where we live, essentially in Europe, and explains the Gulf Stream, and would likely result in quite extreme weather changes. However, what I will say is that the kind of scale of things that are, you know, often used in kind of scaremongering, or like the kind of thing you see in Day After Tomorrow, is that magnitude is completely overstated. And whilst it is a phenomenon that we are observing, I don't think it's likely to have the sort of significant effects on our lives yet that are projected. And yeah, the magnitude is always overblown. If that is a relief, I hope.
And Chiara, do you want to come in with your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for the talk. I'm glad that we have some hope. You mentioned the importance of the protests pre-pandemic for lobbying the government to make policies that are legally binding. I was wondering what you thought about how you could maintain that momentum during lockdown when we can't protest as much.
Yeah, that is a really, really important point, because it is so difficult and there's only so much collectivism you can do. And I mean, so many people are now it's not the forefront of your mind, is it? I mean, everyone's going through their own specific version of pandemic hell, and everyone is dealing with a whole bunch of extra stresses and pressures on their lives, and almost survival is more of a priority for lots of people right now. So it is really important to keep that momentum, but I guess it's doing whatever you can to contribute in a small way, and even if that means accepting your impact is going to be slightly smaller this year than it would have otherwise been, that's okay. Still talking about it, talking to people, I mean, we can go to as many online lectures as we like now, which is a benefit. We can skill ourselves up, we can talk to people from across the world, we can still do all that networking. You might not be able to take to the streets with people, but you can still do the kind of the the on the ground grassroots organizing that is really instrumental to achieving political change. So talking to colleagues or getting involved in organizations. And I guess you can also rely on the leverage of big organizations if you fancy getting involved, like NGOs or something like that, who already have clout and rapport with people who wield the pen signing power. It's more frustrating for sure, because it's definitely much more empowering to be able to go and scream and shout and wave a placard with a whole bunch of other people who feel the same way. But I guess we've got to find ways around that and hope, cross our fingers, that the end is in sight.
Oh, thanks so much, Ella. Thanks for answering all those questions, doing a lot of probing ones. Professor Zeller's had to go, but he said he needs to feed his people. But I think he's answered a few, backed up a few of the things that you said as well. I shall pass. Miranda, do you want me to pass on to you first? Yeah.
Yeah, perfect, thanks.